Good morning, everybody. It's my honour and privilege to introduce this morning's plenary. Many intellectual organisations produce awards for their most vibrant and bright young minds, and they often acknowledge these in some sort of material form. Maybe some of them do financial rewards, some of them give out books. Very few actually back their judgment with a really substantial intellectual reward in the form of a plenary at their annual conference. I think it's a very EHBEA thing to do. It's a testimony to EHBEA's commitment to diversity, not just of gender or of ethnicity background, disciplinary background, but also different career stages. People at all career stages have useful and interesting, informative things to say. And I think it's an outstanding feature of EHBEA that we recognise that that's true even at the earliest stages of one's career. And in that respect, I think Olivier is a particularly appropriate recipient of the New Investigator Award. His work isn't just brilliant, as I'm sure you're going to see in today's talk, but it's also diverse and pluralistic in the best possible way. He combines his evolutionary perspectives to his topic not just with acknowledgement and awareness of the neighbouring disciplines, but actually with a deep and substantial knowledge of the disciplines to which he's speaking to and which he's drawing from, outside of the concerns of those of us that come to conferences like this. And even more than that, those disciplines in Olivier's case are particularly those of anthropology and sociology, disciplines that I'm sure many of you have had experiences in finding that the ways of knowing and understanding and discovering things can be somewhat different to those approaches that are more familiar to a conference like this, hypothesis generation, measurement, and so on and so forth. I think it's a mistake to dismiss those other disciplines out of hand, but it can sometimes be hard to engage in a constructive dialogue, and I think Olivier is an outstanding example of someone who can learn from and also contribute to real debates in those fields, as well as teaching us a lot about what those fields can tell us about our concerns. Okay. Last thing I want to say about the outstanding nature of Olivier's work is it's both theoretical and empirical. Substantial contributions on both sides of that divide. Theoretically, he's written this book, images up there, I think. I've read it, it's brilliant, go and buy it. I'm sure he's going to talk plenty about it today. And then also empirically, Olivier's kind of pioneered in some respects something that, well, maybe pioneered might be slightly too strong, I don't know, quantitative cultural history. Certainly made very substantial contributions to looking at cultural history in quantitative terms, measuring things and linking that to what we know about evolved cognition and cultural evolution. He's also worked, aside from all these projects on cultural evolution and evolved cognition, on things like trust and logic and development and the relevance of those things to these larger issues of cultural evolution and cultural change. And EHBEA is not, last thing to say, EHBEA is not the first August institution to recognise the brilliance of Olivier's work. He's recently taken up a post heading up a research group at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena. So we're, I guess, were we first? I'm not sure whether EHBEA were first or Max Planck were first, but we're in good company, certainly, in recognising Olivier's work. His research group there is entitled MINT, stands for Minds and Traditions, and I understand that's going to be at the heart of this morning's talk. Please give warm congratulations and welcome Dr. Olivier Morin.
Thank you very much, Tom, for these kind words, much more than I deserve, I'm sure. Thanks, EHBEA. Thanks for the award. Leslie Newson just told me, oh, you won the Junior Investigator Award. And I said, well, actually, it's the New Investigator Award. And the Max Planck Research Group that I got used to be called the Junior Research Group, and now it's called Independent Research Group. So when I got the award, I said, wait a minute, shouldn't this be Young Investigator Award? Then colleagues started looking at their feet intensely. So I guess I'm a bit old for the young awards, but still, thank you very much. Thanks, EHBEA in particular. I think everything Tom said about the society is true. it is a bit like Britain in the sense that what many people like about the UK is that you can walk around in the street without identity papers. In fact, that's one reason why you have so many migrants who want to come here. And I really like EHBEA for that reason, because I lost my identity papers a long time ago between philosophy, anthropology, and cognitive science. And at EHBEA, they don't ask me to show it, so thanks again. Right, so today's talk is about culture, about the fact that culture is not central to cognition in the way we could imagine it to be, and about how we can acquire culture in the process of doing something else. How culture can be what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. How culture can emerge as a byproduct of regular interaction that don't have cultural transmission as their specific purpose. It won't be about the activities of this group because it's too new, but it will be about this book just out, which kind of summarizes a view of cultural transmission that's become known as a cultural attraction. So cultural attraction, which has been defended by many people, including Tom, where's Tom? Including Tom, but most prominently, of course, by Dan Sperber, can be summarized in two key ideas. And the first idea is relatively straightforward and indeed quite uncontroversial. I don't expect people to disagree or be surprised about it, but it bears elaborating. It's that human traditions are not merely copied, they are transformed, and transformed in non-random ways. And these directions of transformations that culture tends to evolve towards are what the hypothesis calls attractors. Just to give you a very simple example of what this might look like, recently I started looking at the directions of writing in various writing systems around the world, 105 actually, and so syllabaries, alphabets, and so on and so forth. And, just trying to ask the question, what is the preferred direction of writing? And of course, we know what the attractor should be in that case, because most people are right-handed, and so the left to right direction of writing should obviously be favored. So we see that quite clearly when we look at writing systems that have just been invented. Many writing systems are invented de novo today, like in most cases in post-colonial circumstances for messianic or nationalistic reasons. And the people who invent these writing systems don't have one clear-cut ancestor that you could point at. And these systems tend to be overwhelmingly in a left-right direction of writing. Okay, so far so predictable. What's interesting is what happens when writing systems change direction from an ancestor that was either right to left or left to right. If you look at the writing systems that descend from a writing system which used to be written from right to left, you find that 80% of the writing systems that have such an ancestor actually switched from right to left to right. That's preferential transformation in the direction of attraction. We take a direction of writing that's clumsy, that's inconvenient because most people are right-handed, and we switch to one that's better, to one that is left to right. Interestingly, this doesn't happen at all for the writing systems whose ancestor has a left to right direction of writing. These writing systems simply do not shift. An interesting consequence of that is that the fidelity, the faithfulness of cultural transmission depends on the nature of the ancestor. If your ancestor is a right to left writing system, you're not going to be faithful. You're not going to copy it. There's no point in perpetuating a dysfunctional variety, so you're going to switch to left to right. On the other hand, if the ancestor is left to right, then cultural transmission is going to be very faithful indeed. And that's the key idea behind cultural attraction. The fidelity of cultural transmission depends on the input. Cultural transmission is not a mechanism that generally copies what is given. It's selective and is reconstructive. And here comes the second big idea, much more controversial, I think, this one, behind cultural attraction. The process of attraction, this process of transformation towards attractors, is sufficient to make human tradition stable once we mix it with the usual normal interactional capacities of humans, such as communication, theory of mind, argumentation, trust, and so on and so forth. If we take regular human interactions and add attractions to the mix, the chances of getting stable traditions are high. One nice thing about this is that it makes a very influential and heavy hypothesis unnecessary. The hypothesis it makes unnecessary is the hypothesis that we have a general purpose imitation capacity that makes us wired for culture. I'm not saying this hypothesis is wrong, I'm saying it's redundant, and that a lot of it can be explained away, and that a lot can be explained if we just take communication plus attraction as the main determinants of culture. Just to take an analogy, a thought experiment, suppose you have a photocopy machine, a Xerox machine, and like so many Xerox machines, this one is broken. Sorry for the 20th century nature of the analogy. So you take a page of text, a very normal page of text, you put it through the Xerox machine, and since the Xerox machine is completely dysfunctional, it's going to blacken it, it's going to darken it, it's going to add all these messy dark smudges that Xerox machines tend to produce. Okay, so you take this output, this darkened, blackened piece of paper, and you put it back into the Xerox machine and you photocopy it again. What the Xerox machine will do is that it will make it even more dark. It will make it even uglier. It will make it even blacker. Repeat the process n time. You take the output of the machine, you put it back, take the output, you put it back, and so on and so forth. What you get at a certain point in this process is a sheet of paper that's almost entirely black. And now something very interesting happens. Something happens which is that if somebody enters the room and sees you photocopying the black sheet of paper, that person is going to think, first, what is this bloke doing photocopying a black sheet of paper? Second, this photocopier is perfectly functional. It does exactly what a Xerox machine is supposed to do. It takes the black sheet of paper as an input, and it produces a black sheet of paper as an output. The photocopier is a replicator. It imitates what it's given. Of course, we know that it's not true. It imitates only for a specific kind of input, which is the black sheet of paper. The idea behind cultural attraction is that culture is the black sheet of paper. Culture is well replicated and well imitated because it has evolved to fit the biases of the human mind. The human mind is like the broken Xerox machine, and culture is like the black page. And what we're looking at is, what we try to do is to look at such attractors, at such black sheets of paper. Now, Now this is, I don't want to draw lines in the sand or to make divisions unnecessarily strong, but this point of view does stand apart from a big chunk of the literature on cultural transmission and evolution. If we look at the direction that the field is taking, a lot of research effort is spent looking at things like over-imitation, faithful transmission, and social influence. And this is not a foolish idea. There is a lot to be said for the view that cultural transmission depends on replication. One very strong argument is that all the other lineages we know in the biological world do depend on replication. Where would life be if the good tricks of nature could not be recorded in our DNA? Where would bird songs be if birds did not have a domain-specific adaptation to record bird songs? So it makes sense to assume that human culture does rest upon a similar mechanism. There is a big case to be made, too, for the importance of faithful transmission for cumulative culture. Many people believe that human cultures are what they are because of a domain-specific adaptation to copy culture. There's also a widespread belief that social influence is capable of trumping our inborn biases to the point that we even imitate prestigious people when they commit suicide. I disagree with all these ideas, but they are not straw men and are not trivial in any obvious sense. Now, what we try to do in the cultural attraction framework is to replace these domain general adaptations to culture with things that are not cultural specific at all, like communication and the activity of interpretation, like argumentation, like epistemic vigilance, which is the faculty to resist lies and deception through the exercise of argumentative activities. All these mechanisms that we study in the general framework of cognitive science, as opposed to social psychology, all these mechanisms have something in common. They are not wired for culture. When you communicate with someone, when you argue, when you try to convince someone, or when you resist argumentation, you are not engaging in a copying activity, and you are not trying to acquire culture. you are trying to do something else. You are trying to go about your life, to acquire information, to exploit or help others, and so on and so forth. And all these things produce something that you might call under-imitation, as opposed to over-imitation. Over-imitation is what happens when people are so keen on acquiring culture that they will replicate as much as they can, including the irrelevant bits. Under-imitation is the opposite. Under-imitation is what happens when we select, when we transform, when we distort what goes around us in order to produce traditions that are maximally attractive for the human mind. Okay, so recently there's been lots of interesting discussions on this in the journal Biological Theory. I think we're very, very lucky to have extremely intelligent and benevolent contradictors and critics. So this paper is about Tom Scott Phillips, Dan Sperber, and Nicolas Clébier's work chiefly, and this one is about mine. And many of these critics revolve around the same issue, which is, are you so different from the models that we're used to having in cultural evolution? I will answer that question in the remaining part of the talk, but before I do that, I'm a philosopher, I come from the social sciences, so model fit is not exactly my priority. I'm more looking at the fundamental issues of what really happens in the human mind when we acquire culture. There are lots of models that we can fit to the reality of cultural transmission. Some will fit more or less well. But the deeper issue is to arrive at an understanding of what are the cognitive mechanisms involved in cultural transmission. That said, the attraction hypothesis does, I think, force us to think about cultural transmission in a different way. Just to take a look at what these differences might look like. I've tried to test these ideas, to test the difference between the cultural attraction view of cultural transmission and a more traditional view based on imitation in a slightly original way, which is by looking at the history of aesthetic practices in a quantitative fashion. I did it first of all because it was fun, which is always a good reason to do research, but also because these practices, like children's games, like styles of portraiture and painting, like the shape of letters in graphic systems, like the kind of vocabulary that's employed in novels, this kind of practice is exactly the kind of practice that we would expect to get over-imitated and to produce arbitrary traditions. So I consider cultural practices that are functionally neutral. Their carriers arguably get little or no fitness boost from them, obviously, and also they are likely to become imitated in an arbitrary way if the over-imitation model is accurate. And I also consider how they evolve in a very long run of cultural history. Here, taking my cue from a tradition of research that goes way back into the past and originates in the French school of cultural history called l'histoire de la longue durée. So, taking this attraction model of cultures and marrying it with a longue durée view of cultural history gets us quantitative cultural history of aesthetic traits in the long run. Taking a long view on the history of these traits, a long view that's restricted to what we can document, of course, so it will be a matter of a few centuries. Taking this long view allows us to see what happens when, when local social norms are not consistent and durable enough to constrain culture. If you take a tradition that has come across 5 centuries and 10 different countries, it becomes very hard to argue that the fate of that cultural practice depends on the whims of a local opinion leader or depends on the whims of a local majority. We have to take attraction into account to account for the dynamics of change that affect these traditions. Okay, so yeah, if you take these two views apart, if you try to test these two views apart, well, we expect, if an over-imitation account is right, that aesthetic features should be over-imitated from local leaders and majorities who impose arbitrary tastes. On the other hand, if these aesthetic features are under-imitated, if they are distorted and transformed until they fit or biases, then we would expect some directional protracted change in the direction of cultural attraction. So the shape of cultural lineages would look a bit like this under the over-imitation hypothesis, with local norms and local leaders imposing an arbitrary change in some aesthetic features, and then a new norm or leader imposing a new change, and people following suit. In this view, cultural lineages should be divergent, differing between a given society at a given time, and also fragile, because one of the key properties of replicative mechanisms is that they don't repair mistakes. A replicative mechanism copies the model, all the model, nothing but the model. A replicative mechanism doesn't try to repair or to come back to an earlier version of a tradition, it simply copies blindly. Not so with cultural attraction. We expect cultural lineages under an attraction model to converge towards preferred directions of evolution, just like the left-right direction of writing in the example of writing systems. We also expect them to be robust. Why? Because cultural attraction has this nice property that it can repair mistakes. If your model departs from attraction, you can reconstruct what went wrong, and you can get a traditional form that is closer to the ideal. If the black sheet of paper for some reason becomes slightly grayish, the broken Xerox machine will bring it back to black. If a writing system is not switches from left to right to left by some kind of cultural accident, then attraction will bring it back to the left to right direction of writing, which is the attractive position. This leads us to believe that cultural traditions should be much more resilient than under alternative models. Okay, now just to illustrate this first view, I have two examples. One of them is a work in progress. The other is published a few years ago, of protracted directional aesthetics changes that we can't attribute to local fads, leaders, or majorities, and that I think can't either be attributed to social norms that would be active locally at one time or place. The first example is a work in progress with Alberto EHBEA. Hey. It's about the cool style in Anglophone fiction. Here's Hemingway looking cool. Here's Alberto looking even cooler. So cool style is, when you avoid excessive emotional expression in writing, and it's been associated with Hemingway. But I think it can be shown that the drive towards the cool dates back long before Hemingway and continued after him. And that was discovered by Alberto EHBEA and colleagues in 2014 on Google Ngram data. Here's two ways of measuring the content, the amount of emotional expression in literature in English-speaking works contained in the Ngram corpus. This contains both fiction and non-fiction, but this also obtains when you consider only fiction. And interestingly, this trend does not seem to be, on the face of it, completely restricted to English-speaking countries. You also find similar trends in Italian, in Russian, in Spanish, in French, and German. Now, these data are extremely limited for many reasons, and the most important is that nobody knows what's in the Google Ngram database, because as with many things that Google does, Google won't tell us how it assembles it. So what we've been doing is to replicate and check this effect for a smaller data corpus. I call it small data because it's a corpus that's handmade. We built it ourselves. We know what's in it. We know the authors. We know their date of birth. We know their gender. We know the genre of the novels and so on. So we can control for all these extraneous sociological factors that many people would say are involved or could explain the shift towards a cooler style in fiction. So there are two corpus, one with 200 famous authors, and more importantly, I think, because that's one of the things that data-driven approaches to culture can do, is to take us out of the canon and help us consider the authors that nobody reads, that nobody talks about, usually because they're totally forgotten or mediocre, but they're no less important for that for cultural evolution. We can also consider obscure authors. And controlling for the author's fame, for the author's age, for the author's gender, their vocabulary size, and preferred literary genre, we find the exact same decrease in emotionality as found by EHBEA et al. 2014. It's similar in both its pace, its rhythm, so the magnitude of the decrease is of the same order in the n-gram data and in our small data corpus. And it is also similar in its qualitative nature. So the emotions that decrease are first and foremost the positive emotions, while the negative emotions stagnate or show no decline. And that's interesting because you have 2 centuries. Oh, I forgot to mention that it's 1 century longer than was found in the n-gram data, which were restricted to the 20th century. This trend dates back at least to the Romantic period. So for 2 centuries, decade after decade, year after year, writers have been consistently under-imitating their peers and predecessors. They've been ever so slightly changing the amount of emotional expression in novels in a directional fashion, in a predictable way. They have been going towards a direction that both repeats the past and anticipates the future. Okay, so I think this is the kind of cultural dynamics that's very hard to account for in terms of the influence of an arbitrary local norm. Another example of the same kind of dynamic is the gaze revolution in European and Asian portraits. It's a phenomenon whereby portraits turn their gaze upon the audience, turn their gaze upon the viewer in at least 2 and arguably 3 independent traditions. So just a bit of background on this. There's been a lot of work, a lot of amazing work in in comparative art history, but also in sociobiology. That was one of Eibel-Eibel's big ideas about the importance of eye gaze representations in human cultures. If you go to a museum of comparative word art, you will see all these icons with enormous eyes, all these faces where eyes are exaggeratedly big, and so on and so forth. So we expect eyes to be ubiquitous in human cultures for many reasons that are due to their evolutionary and cognitive relevance. But that does not quite work for portrait traditions. And in portrait traditions, you do have a case of local norms, ethical, aesthetical, and courtesy norms constraining the representation of eye gaze. And in fact, there are many traditions where eye gaze is, direct eye gaze is almost forbidden. And you have hardly any portrait at all that gazes at the viewer. That's the case in Japan, that's the case in Mughal India, for instance. On the other hand, you have traditions where direct gaze is almost systematically direct, like the Greek Fayum portraits. I got interested in the traditions that are mixed, the traditions that allow both the expression of direct gaze and the expression of averted gaze. And I took a look at 2 well-documented, at least for the first traditions, where both gaze directions exist, Korean portraits and European portraits. Now, the hypothesis of cultural attractions tells us that because direct eye gaze is cognitively appealing, because it's like the black sheet of paper, really, if and when local standards of portraiture are allowed to change, then they should change in that direction and stay there. We know that because there's this beautiful body of work in developmental and comparative psychology on the appeal of direct gaze that shows how attention-grabbing direct gaze can be for newborns as early as 2 days old, but also for adults, at least when the face is an image as opposed to an actual person. Because actual persons look threatening and muddle the effect. Okay, so what I found were 2 gaze shifts. One in Korean portraiture and the other in Western Renaissance portraiture. Of course, there are many limits to this kind of data and many things that should be unpacked in order to make real sense of the phenomenon. But the basic fact is clear. Direct gaze goes from being very, very low in Europe and inexistent in Korea to being the majority of portraits. And it stayed there for centuries in the case of Renaissance Europe. In the case of Korea, of Korean portraiture, the art form basically dies before it can reach full maturity. So these shifts are interesting in that they also take very, very long time. Even this takes basically 2 centuries to happen. Obviously, the first reaction of any art historian or of any anthropologist, of any sociologist, is to say, well, you should consider the social norms X, Y, and Z. And this is where things get really interesting, because when we look in detail at the Renaissance gaze shift in Europe, so this is the 16th century data, which I looked into deeper detail to try to tease out the influence of various factors, we find out that many of the usual suspects actually don't explain the shift. The first reaction of an art historian is to blame it on mannerism. So mannerism was this extremely showy, garish style of painting that imposed itself in the later part of the 16th century, earlier part of the 17th. And direct gaze is a very mannerist move because it's showy, it's attention-grabbing, it's slightly vulgar in its ostension for the art specialists of the time and so on. But international mannerism actually arises long before the shift, long after the shift starts taking place, and it vanishes from the map long before the shift is quite completed. So the timing of international mannerism is wrong. The rise of standalone autonomous portraits, all of the data I collected are standalone autonomous portraits, does not explain the shift either. The Reformation does not explain the shift. So many people have this idea that Reformation brings with it a new ideal of the human individual, that the Reformation focuses people's minds on their identity and personal life story and destiny in relation to God's plan, whereas Catholicism was more about inclusion in a broader collectivity. So there is the view that the shift towards individualism might have something to do with an assertion of the individual, and direct gaze could flow from there. This doesn't work because, once again, the timing is off. The shift starts long before that in the later 15th century, and it's also present in Catholic countries, just as countries that are in the midst of wars of religion or Reformation movements. Bourgeois individualism does not explain the shift either. You find the shift in rich people, you find the shift in poor people, you find the shift in the aristocrats, you find the shift among the nobility. We find the shift in Counter-Reformation Italy, and we find the shift in Counter-Reformation Netherlands. We find the shift in poor countries like France or Italy. We find the shift in rich countries like the Netherlands. Gender roles, and that was extremely surprising to me, don't explain the shift either, because in fact there is no difference in the amount of gaze direction between men and women, which every art book I've seen says the opposite. And you find also the shift inside men's portraits considered singly, and inside the corpus of women's portraits considered singly too. And lastly, fossilization, preservation biases, can't explain the shift because actually the amount of direct gaze in a portrait does not depend on its date, but on the painter's date of birth. It was a shift driven by different generations of painter, and the actual date of the painting is not the best predictor of direct gaze expression. Right. So that was the first point, the convergence of cultural lineages over some kind of directional dynamics. Another prediction that the cultural attraction hypothesis orients us towards is the robustness of cultural lineages. Why robustness? Well, because one key feature of cultural attraction is the ability to repair changes, is the ability to reverse degradation in cultural material. And this touches on a debate that that's been progressing a lot, with lots of great input in the work of Jamie Terani on fairy tales, for instance, which is the possibility of very long-standing cultural lineages. So there is pros and cons to the view that cultural lineages should be very robust. We can take, two very different views at the issue. On the side against robustness, we should note that if culture is driven by replication, then blind replication mechanisms should not be able to repair mistakes. That's the definition of replication in Dawkins' in Dawkins' 1982 extended phenotype. The key feature of replication is that replication is blind to the mistakes of the model. You copy the model, all the model, nothing but the model. this kind of dynamics will bring about a loss of information eventually, even if the replication mechanism is very faithful. A small amount of degradation will inevitably accumulate because the links in the chain cannot repair mistakes. And in fact, that's what we see in many cultural transmission studies ever since Bartlett started exploring them in his book on memory. In the study where he had students memorize and transmit the War of the Ghosts story, it took no more than 6 transmission steps for the story to be reduced to cold porridge, for the War of the Ghosts to lose most of its protagonists, its titles, and its ghosts. So we have good reasons to think that in linear transmission chains, information should get degraded to the point that cultural traditions can't really maintain themselves, and that robust lineages tend to be washed out, at least when the information is arbitrary. But there are also reasons to think that cultural lineages should be very robust, and attraction is one of them. One of the big points made by Sperber, but also by a very beautiful study by Kalish, Griffith, and Lewandowski on the robustness of transmission, is that cultural transmission can also repair mistakes and bring us closer towards attractive cultural forms. Cultural transmission is like the broken Xerox machine. It will churn out black sheets of paper that are more likely to be passed on faithfully because they correspond to intuitive biases. So repeated transmission changes culturally transmitted items, and it makes them easier to pass on. Transmission, as seen by cultural attraction, is not faithful. It's better than faithful. It's robust as opposed to blind. And this makes traditions more likely to thrive and be passed on. There's also another important body of literature that focuses on robustness and redundancy, with important contributions by people like Enquist, which dwells on the fact that repetition and multiple exposure make transmission more accurate. So the reason why transmission failed in Bartlett's experiment was because it was a game of telephone type of chain, a Chinese whispers type of chain, where A transmits something to B, who transmits it to C, and so on and so forth. But cultural transmission is not like that. Cultural transmission is not a Chinese whispers game. It typically, when I acquire some cultural item, I acquire from a multitude of models, and this allows me to factor out the mistakes and the distortions, and to acquire a more robust, a more repairable version of the item. Importantly, these mechanisms work even when the underlying mechanisms have low fidelity. So even when the mechanisms are very unfaithful, these things can produce robust cultural chains. Classic example of that is the preservation of words in the lexicon. So we know from a work by Pegel and others that some words are last much longer than others in the lexicon because they are repeated more frequently. And when you hear a word more frequently, well, it stabilizes in your memory, and you also hear it from many different sources, which helps you to get a better sound image, so to speak, of it. This is a case of culture happening to you while you're busy making other plans. You are not thinking when you wake up in the morning, today I'm going to acquire and reinforce the stability of the word cafeteria, but I don't care about the preservation of the word gramophone. Yet you end up acquiring cafeteria and stabilizing it in your mind longer than the word gramophone, simply because you hear cafeteria a lot. Of course, when you go about your business in the cafeteria, you're not obsessed with fitting in the culture that has the word cafeteria in it and ignoring the culture that has the word gramophone in it. It just happens to your mind that a word will get stabilized and others won't. And again, no need for a faithful cultural transmission mechanism to get this kind of effects. Right. To try to contribute to this exciting research on the robustness of cultural traits, I try to tackle, and this is in the book, I try to tackle one mystery that has puzzled lots of students of folklore over the years, which is the stability of children's traditions. We know from a big body of work that goes on as far back as the Renaissance, as I will show, that children have traditions. By children, I mean what's often called middle childhood, 6 to 12, children who are very often in peer groups, the existence of children's peer group is arguably human universal. And these children used to have their own durable folklore that was transmitted from child to child. Now, it's very hard for us to admit of this idea because everything has changed now. Because with the rise of mass media and entertainment industry, childhood is not what it used to be. It's a cliche, but it's true. And it means that our best sources for this kind of folklore kind of get stuck in the middle of the 1960s. But from the 1960s to as far back as the first very good folklore collections of the 19th century, and the also quite good collections of the modern times and Renaissance, we do have a well-documented account of peer-to-peer transmission of children's folklore. We know this from the nature of the folklore. We know this from what our sources tell us about how it was transmitted. We know this from a field report by ethnographers in the 1950s. We also know this from direct questionnaire studies on the transmission of things like Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Moo, and so on and so forth. So it's a puzzle. Why is it a puzzle? Because these traditions have to be transmitted horizontally or almost horizontally in order to survive. And we also know in the classic cultural transmission models that horizontal transmission is good at spreading traditions that have to spread far and wide in a minimum amount of time. But it's not so good at fostering long-standing traditions. For that, vertical transmission is better. Why is it better? Well, because you can take advantage of the future that is embodied in a younger generation. If I want to transmit a tale or a joke far away in time, in the future, I can tell it to a child, that I can tell it to my niece, I can tell it to somebody who's 25, 30 years younger than me, and that person, 30 years from now, will be adult and will be able to tell the tale to another generation. And in this fashion, a tradition can span 2, 3, 5 centuries with only a few episodes of transmission in between. That doesn't work for children's peer culture. If you're in the playground, you're a kid in the playground and you want to transmit a tradition far away in time, the only thing you can do is to transmit it to somebody slightly younger than you, a 6-year-old as opposed to an 8-year-old. But that 6-year-old, in 3 years from now, he will have to transmit it to somebody who's slightly younger. And in this fashion, it takes many, many more transmission episodes for the same tradition to be transmitted from one child to one child than for it to go through the vehicle of vertical transmission. So we should expect that the traditions that walk this treadmill of quasi-horizontal transmission should suffer a great deal of wear and tear and should, as a result, not be so stable. And the folklorists have known this for many, many years. It was a puzzle also in the 19th century, and their answer was, well, children are conservative. They're imitation machines, they're obsessed with conformity, and so they replicate everything that they're told, and as a result, children's traditions are very stable. It's not a satisfactory answer for a number of reasons, and one of them is that children don't appear to know what games are traditional from what games aren't. For instance, if you take the game of elastics or the game of hula hoop, these are not traditional games. They are introduced very recently. But if you take games like blind man's buff, hide and seek, and so on, these are extremely traditional games. These are long-standing games, or cat's cradles also. Children don't know about this difference, but they should replicate them all the same. But some of them become traditional and some of them don't. So this hypothesis does not account for the gap between the traditional practices and the one that aren't. If you follow the cultural attraction view, on the other hand, this puzzle dissipates, because we know that cultural transmission can be very robust because of reconstruction. Some games are so attractive and so appealing that they are like the black sheet of paper. Children will either transmit them faithfully or distort them until they become appealing enough. So multiple transmission does no harm to attractive traditions, but it does erase the unpopular game, the other traditions. So we would expect also a mass of undocumented dark games games that have not made it necessarily into the historical records because children just jettison them. And in fact, when you read the field reports of ethnographers of childhood, they do document that many times children will invent a game or a rhyme one day that will be very popular that day and then just crash into oblivion and will never be reused on other days. So I took a look at this book. It's a French classic, Rabelais' Adventures of Gargantua. It's a book that's famous in the childhood folklore literature because it contains a list that was gold for us, because it's a list of more than 200 games that Gargantua, Rabelais' hero, plays at when Gargantua is a kid. So Gargantua is a superhuman ogre, a giant with all sorts of powers. At that stage in the novel, he's a child, but he's no ordinary child. He eats buffaloes for breakfast, which children usually don't. And so the games that he plays at are a mix of children's games, adult games, and games practiced by all generations. And this is nice because we have a list where you find very, very comparable games, both from children's peer culture, from adults' peer culture, and from cross-generational populations. Now, these games have been extensively documented by every publisher and translator of Rabelais ever since the 16th century, and there have been lots of editions. And it became kind of a puzzle game. People wanted to know what exactly this weird game was. They had correspondences about it, they asked their friends, and as a result of that, we have an exceptionally long record of the survival of these games in various countries of Europe, especially France, to which my sources are limited, but you can also look at the German or British sources. So we can trace these games back in time, and we can also look at the Middle Age records for them. So this is just a partial, just a portion of the data set. So among the 216 games in, this probably means I should stop. The computer is telling me something. I won't be long. Okay. I have to go manual on that? Yes. So yeah, I could trace 103 games out of the 216 in Rabelais' list, and I documented them across more than 100 sources that were all systematically checked. And what we can see is that the folklorists were basically right on one thing, which is that children are indeed very good at stabilizing traditions, as good in fact as adults. This is 1534, the date of collection of the Rabelais. My records stop in 1930 and start as far back as 1250. As you can see, the Middle Age sources are much more likely to record adult games for various reasons that I can explain. So this shows that basically the folklorists were right in saying that children's traditions can really stand the test of time. And when you think about it, it's puzzling because an adult game can really rely on a great time depth. A 60-year-old adult can pass on a game to a 25-year-old adult. With children's games, the time window is much, much, much narrower. So what we see here, in terms of number of transmission episodes, in terms of number of cultural generation, is in fact a vastly larger number of cultural generations than what we see here. Another prediction that's borne out by the data is the existence of unrecorded games. It's the existence of a selection bias. These games are actually the tip of the iceberg. Our sources are much less likely to detect children's games than they are to detect adult games. So these games tend to be less documented than these games. Okay. Just to conclude, that was my message today. So there is both a theoretical idea and a mythological invitation, so to speak. The theoretical idea is that culture is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. Copying others need not be the typical, adapted, or usual function of the mental mechanisms involved in cultural transmission. The second aspect of the talk is an invitation to engage in dialogue with historians, art historians, anthropologists, to get nice data on cultural evolution and to try to complement the standards approaches based on modeling and experiment. Thank you very much for your attention.
sure there are going to be plenty of questions. If I don't come to you straight away, I'll keep scanning the room, catch my eye, and I'll go around in turn. I've already seen one hand just there.
Thank you. Extremely interesting, wonderful talk. I think if I understand what you're saying, under imitation describes a sort of convergent process, a process of conversion of differences towards the black sheet of paper over time, towards our cognitive biases and so on. But what you didn't discuss, but probably you have elsewhere, is a sort of big bang that generates the initial differences that we now see slowly disappearing. And I suspect that one wouldn't want to have a big bang, but rather a theory in which there are continual innovations in culture, perhaps coming from whatever the leader approach or something like that, and then they gradually tend to dissipate, but they get disturbed again, and so we never see that black piece of paper, and we have instead a stochastic equilibrium with this under-imitation, which is, say, an autoregressive coefficient less than 1, and we constantly have innovation terms, and so we get a sort of dispersion around this black sheet of paper of the practices that we observe. And so we really need both processes to be part of the story.
Absolutely, yes. I quite agree. So I do have a theory about how the big bangs that produce differences can happen. There are many mechanisms, but one that's interesting for the kind of data shown here is bottleneck effects. When a very small group sets the tone for a whole tradition. And that happens a lot. Of course, a lot has been said on the interactions between demography and culture and how small groups can kind of tweak the generally deterministic process that we have. In the case of literature, you had this romantic wave that imposed an extremely emotional and loud style in fiction. And you might see what happens after that as regression to the mean. In the case of portraiture, I think the answer is more sociological in terms of the kind of manners imposed by the court society, where staring at people is rude and so on and so forth. So I do agree that under-imitation is not the whole story. And there is a lot of noise-producing accidents that would produce the kind of big bangs you mentioned.
I already have 5 more questions lined up, so can I ask those who are asking to keep them short and brief, please?
Try to do the same as the answers.
Yeah, and the answers too. You're first, yeah.
All right, so I like the scheme in general, but I'm a little bit worried that it seems to imply that the attractive basins are stable. And the reason I'm thinking about this is because, for example, with the right-to-left writing, part of the drive for it might have been you smear the ink if you move your hand over it in that direction. Mm-hmm. So, or something like that. I don't mean necessarily that that's the story for that thing, but the point is that there do seem to be times when there's a high transmission in a particular direction. Mm-hmm. When you talked about the Romantic period, it may be that too much of the Romantic period makes the other thing attractive. Sure. And so it might be useful to have a theory of how the attractions are generated and whether they're stable or not, and whether it's very specific to specific things.
So I agree with your general comment, not so much with the ink thing, because for various reasons this obtains independently of there's lots of incision processes in writing that don't involve this. That's a detail. Yes, it's a recurrent comment that attractors should be dynamic, and in fact, if we take our cues from dynamic systems theory, they should be. I'm not blocking the door on this. Of course, we want to start simple with the simplest things and then envisage the more complex hypothesis only later. In the case of direct gaze, again, we have to consider that the process takes 200 years, at least, and then it stays there. So what would be the shifting basin of attraction here? I don't know. I try to find cases that illustrate attraction in the simplest way and then add some society contingent factors later. I think it's more parsimonious approach, even if it's a bit reductionist. I must say, you might be right about this.
Question on the similar theme. What's your prediction? Are we forever stuck with the QWERTY keyboard of our PCs? On the surface, it might look like a stupid question, but what I mean is that evolution of a keyboard took a long time, and then it has stabilized, and it has been challenged many times over, but it doesn't seem to shift. But as far as I can tell, I cannot find any rational reason why the QWERTY keyboard is the way it is. It doesn't seem to be more functional than anything else.
I'm a big fan of the QWERTY or AZERTY keyboard. In fact, it has lots of merits. No, but seriously, so Paul David has this view that culture tends to lock in on dysfunctional equilibria, and the QWERTY keyboard is the textbook case. So you have to consider the cost and the benefits. I think that the relative costs of having a QWERTY are very low, and in fact, it's not so dysfunctional, because we get used to whatever is in front of our hands, anyways. So that's why I think the QWERTY is not going away anytime soon. On the other hand, if we take the very, very long view, I wouldn't place my bets on the QWERTY simply because 200 years from now, most keyboards could be in Chinese or whatever. So.
Down here now.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
I love all this stuff about under-imitation and all the way in which culture shifts to fit the contours of the mind, so to speak. But how do you reckon? How does work by people like Richard Minari and Andy Clark, where they say, culture actually shifts the way in which the mind and the contours of the mind, and they're extended, and technology actually changes the way in which we do things. So how do you bring those two things together in your...
I'm bringing it in the next 5 years. So this research group that I didn't talk much about is actually quite keen on trying to come up with an explanation on the rise of external props to cognition, mostly graphic systems and writing. I'm puzzled by the fact, I'll make this very short, but I'm puzzled by the fact that humans are so bad at building graphic codes as opposed to linguistic codes and gestures. We're very good at communicating as long as it involves interactions and so on, but we're very bad at creating these external props to cognition that are so vital today. And I have a theory about why they evolved when they did, but that would be for another day.
No? I didn't. Oh, you've been asked. Okay, then
just quickly, I was thinking.
Oh, no, the question's there, sorry. Do you want to ask? Go on, Pete.
So, Olivier, how do you account for the divergence of things like divergent traditions, for example, language, or even things like tools? So the Japanese woodworking tools are quite different from American woodworking tools. So it seems to me lots of traditions just diverge endlessly, and there's no tendency for them to converge. How do you account for such things?
I don't mean to deny so I had these two kind of phenomena, and I didn't want to say that the first kind doesn't happen. And in the case of portraits, for instance, you have something like an endless divergence of styles. I'm trying to add something to the mix, not to deny the reality of divergence of language. In fact, there are many cases where you do have an accumulation of arbitrary traits, and that's what allows us, for instance, to have language phylogenies, because you have this very much like what happens with DNA, this accumulation of arbitrary information that can serve as markers. I really don't want to give the impression that I deny the existence of all this.
Okay, we started a couple of minutes late, so we're going to try and squeeze in the last two questions I've caught, as long as we keep them brief. So one of them is just here.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. By the way, the QWERTY keyboard is designed as it is because early typewriters couldn't cope with the speed that people type. This is an extremely crass and insensitive question, but do you think the predominance of English language nowadays has something to do with the fact that we haven't got an equivalent of the Académie Française? that that in other words, attractors are allowed to operate?
Oh well. So I'm going to do just for you. I'm going to blow my chances with the academy for a lifetime. I will never get in. No, it's so you would be right if the Académie Française had any relevance and any power at all. It doesn't.
That's a concise answer. Do you still